There we go. Okay. Are we all here?
Yes.
There's gossiping at the back. I can see it. Mr. Salesman, will you give over selling stuff and tell people to sit down? We're going to start. Excellent. I'm sure Jill will shut the door for us if she's there. Thanks, Alan. I'll let you know, Alan, yeah. Okay. Well, welcome to this November meeting of the Newbiggin by the Sea Genealogy Project. As usually happens, we'll probably have an influx of people about 1 minute past 2. Oh, here we are. That's very good. So we'll just let people come in. I'm just saying that people have been asking about Jimmy Dawson. Eleanor's been asking about Jimmy Dawson, just to say that Jacqueline, his sister, is on there. And I can't actually hear very well what Jacqueline's saying, but I've asked her to email me about how Jimmy is, and I'll pass that on. And I'm sure that Jacqueline will pass back the message from all of us that we're all thinking of him and very concerned about him, and we'll try and get in touch with him before the next meeting. We have a meeting in several parts today, just to be sure. As you'll see, as you'll hear, we've got a new PA system, which isn't ours, but which is borrowed, and I think it's just gone down again. Can you still hear me through it? Yeah, you can still hear me. Okay. No, that's very good.
It's so much better.
It's so much better. Oh, fantastic. Okay. The first thing to say is that we've got a speaker here, Isaac Grint, to lead our discussions today, and welcome to Alan. And Alan's also has with him a magnificent book, From Picks to Rifles, which is absolutely full of information. I would strongly recommend that you buy it. I'm going to buy one, and I hope that we'll have it on sale in the Family History Centre as well. A couple of other notices, really. Of course, we've got the raffle later on, but after Alan's bit, we've got a piece about Fred Lamb, Private Fred Lamb, the absolute hero of November the 7th, 1941, the bombing of Newbiggin. And Jim Armstrong, who's online at the moment on Zoom. Jim has some more information about some really fantastic work he's been doing in Stockport with the school and with Fred's granddaughter. And there's some information on all of the tables about Fred Lamb. So that's something for later. But I'm going to do a bit of work on the Zoom, because we've got somebody else joining us there as well. And then I'm going to hand over to Alan and to Julia, who are going to give us our presentation. So please give them a round of Sorry, and the other thing to say is that we've got the legendary Dot joining us from the middle of Sunday night, or Saturday night in New Zealand, the early hours of Sunday morning from New Zealand. So give Dot a welcome as well, please. Yeah, we can hear you, yeah. Yeah, well, we're just starting now. Right, Rich, I'm not very certain about how we get this on there. It's good to have a technical expert. There we are. Grand. Okay, can the people on Zoom see the screen? Yes, excellent. Very good. Okay, hand over to Al.
Okay, good afternoon. Today I'm going to talk to you about the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve.
Really close to your mouth. Really close to your mouth.
The Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve and how it relates to Newbiggin by the Sea and to Newbiggin by the Sea's mining community.
Is it switched on? Because it's not coming. It's not coming from the speaker.
Okay, I'll try and speak louder.
Switch it on.
There's a green light.
Try again.
Okay, so this presentation tries to show you how important the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve was to the British Army and Navy in World War I. It tries to show how a not well-known unit, the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, managed to enlist thousands of men from the mining villages of Northumberland and Durham and from the mining village of Newbiggin by the Sea. And so today we're going to try and work through this, and this is their story, the men from Newbiggin by the Sea. Next. Right, what was the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve? Well, the British Army and Navy didn't do very well in the Boer War. We didn't cover ourselves with any great victory, although we won the war. Remember, we're just fighting against irregulars. So it was seen that the British Army and Navy needed more reservists. And so Lord Haldane reviewed the situation, and he developed what we know as a territorial force for the Army. At the same time, the Navy developed its own reserve force, the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve. Now, this was a force for civilians. So it wasn't for Navy people who left the forces. They were assigned to the Royal Naval Reserve. This was for civilians. And in 1903, an Act of Parliament was passed to allow the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve to form. In 1905, the Tyne Division was formed. All the divisions of the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve were formed along the great rivers of England, the Clyde, the Thames, the Mersey. And so the Tyne was an obvious place to place a reserve. Now, the initial reserves, which did contain some miners, came from places like South Shields, which were on the Tyne, Benwell, which was on the Tyne, and Bladen area. So we had a number of pre-war reservists. In 1907, the Tyne gained a depot ship, HMS Calypso, which you know as if you go to the Tyne Market, which now is a reservist base beneath the bridges at Newcastle. But this was a pre-war destroyer, and it was brought up the Tyne and berthed above the Armstrong Whitworth Works along the Bladen, along the Scotswood Road. Next slide. Okay, this is just a little picture I thought I'd put up. It's actually of Ashington, and these men are actually waiting to board a train to go to Newcastle to enlist. Over the course to the end of 1915, nearly 4,000 miners enlisted in the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, of which 2,700 went into the Naval Brigades. Now, the talk really is about the Naval Brigades. These are the people, the rifle strength of the battalions that were formed. For Newbiggin by the Sea, 106 miners enlisted. 106 men enlisted, sorry, 92 were miners. 73 went to the Naval Brigades. 7 were channeled into the Royal Marines. 7 were medically unfit, even though they were working down the mines. And 5 went to the Royal Navy and other forms of naval areas like minesweepers. So fishermen tended to be pushed into minesweeping. This is an artist's depiction of HMS Calypso on the Tyneside Division. Men would come here initially to enroll, to enlist, have a basic medical, try to understand what age they were, because you've got to remember there were no birth certificates at those times. An interesting thing for young miners was that they gave the same date of birth, month of birth, but they dropped a few years onto their age. And you can see that very interesting throughout the enlistment. Next slide. Right, this is the Naval Brigades. They were officially named after, the battalions were officially named after famous admirals. Benbow, Collingwood, Hawke, Drake. We've all known them for your history books. And here, just to show you, they all had a nice tally on their caps. And this is a guy from Newbiggin, John Richard Mills Wood, who survived the war and died in 1964. Right, at the outset of war, in August 6, 1914, the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve was drawn together, basically in Kent, and formed into 3 brigades. One was the Royal Marine Brigade, the other was 1st Naval, and the second was 2nd Naval. They basically were the pre-war men I've talked about, the Royal Naval Reservists, which I said were naval men, and a load of spare naval stokers who didn't have ships to work on, together with 3,000 Kitchener's volunteers, which were very quickly snapped up by Churchill and formed into the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve. And because of that, this force became known as Churchill's Little Army. Right. As I've said, they formed up in August, yet in October they were dispatched to Antwerp to try and stop the Germans taking Antwerp because they required this as a port. It was a chaotic expedition. Even Churchill turned up to try and lead his men, who was rebuffed. However, they took up their position between the forts which protected Antwerp. And it was chaotic, seriously chaotic. Within a day, they were asked to leave because their position was untenable. The orders that were given were chaotic at least. Some of the battalions didn't get orders, some got them hours later than they should be. And so, a little story unfolded. here we have the 1st Brigade minus Drake Battalion entering Holland. And so they were interned for the war. That was about 1,700 men. They were sent to Northern Holland, to Groningen, where a camp was made for them. Their food was not very good initially, but eventually the Dutch took them under their wing. Their wives could come and see them, and eventually the men got parole. They could come back to England for a month, as long as they promised not to fight or do work while they were in England, and they had to return. If they didn't return, obviously no men would be allowed out to the country. This is a picture of the camp, which was nicknamed HMS Timbertown, and you can see how these men went into battle, still wearing their naval kit. They were, they turned up at Dunkirk without supplies. Drake's commander-in-chief, medical officer, had to borrow medical supplies. It was a disaster. No Newbiggin men died, but 2 Newbiggin men were there. We've got Charles Gorman, who was with the Hood, and John William Armstrong, which also was Hood Battalion. You can see by the numbers, KX numbers, this determines they were Kitchener's volunteers. Okay? Right. The next big foray was Gallipoli. Another Churchill's great ideas. They landed on the 26th of April, 1915, at a point which is now known as Cape Ellis. 5 beaches were used. At the same time, the force of New Zealand and Australian troops landed on a beach called Anzac Cove, which actually isn't a beach, it was about 100 yards and cliffs straight up. So they had to force their way straight up the cliffs. Later on, the British sent in another expeditionary force, which landed at Suvla Bay. And those will not be talked about today. The Anson Battalion was the first battalion to enter the fray. Basically, their job was beachmasters, to make sure that supplies were taken up from the beach towards the front. The British Army thought this was going to be a walkover. It wasn't. The Turks were there and they were prepared to fight. They killed thousands of people. You've probably heard of Lancashire, the Lancashire Regiment, who lost thousands of men on a day and won 6 Victoria Crosses. So it was not a success. However, a point that I'd like to make was that the aim for the attack was a place there called Krithia. Now, Krithia was always a focus of British attacks, and it was never reached over the 8 months that the Allies were in place. Right. In May, the Allies tried to push forward against the Turks, who were not going to give any land. They had snipers, they actually had machine guns, which the British didn't know about, and a lot of men were killed. And there, in the centre, is the Hellas Memorial, and that contains the names of thousands of men who have no known grave. Gallipoli is very barren, has not very much soil, And so digging a grave at Gallipoli was very difficult. So a lot of bodies lay where they were killed. And we'll talk about that later. These again are two Newbiggin men, John William Armstrong, which we've already seen, who was wounded, and Marmaduke Dodds, again, was wounded. In fact, the Dodds appear to pay a great price at Gallipoli. Next slide. Right, that is just a picture of what it looked like at Gallipoli, and it's said to be a picture of the Collingwoods going over the top on the 4th of June 1915, when they were virtually wiped out. Right, just to go back slightly, I think you remember that 3 battalions had walked into Holland. They were reformed by men from the Tyne Division, from London Division, and they were shipped out and arrived at Gallipoli the 28th of May 1915. For the Collingwood Division, it contained over 300 miners from Northumberland and Durham. And I'm going to show you what happened to them. Next slide. Right, this is known as the Third Battle of Krithia. And this is basically as far as the Allies got. On the right, you'll see the French. Then you'll see the attack, and on the left you've got 42 Division. The idea was to capture these 3 Turkish trenches. Howe, Hood and Anson attacked and made some progress. However, on the right, our French neighbours didn't move. And when they did move forward, they didn't keep up with the attack. So the Turks could enfilade the whole British line. The poor Collingwoods walked into this. Basically, of the 300 miners, 60 odd were killed and 64 were wounded. In fact, in the days that followed, the Collingwood battalion was disbanded, survivors were reallocated to the other battalions, as well as another battalion, the Benbow, which also was disbanded. The casualties were horrendous. Now, you can see the casualties. I'm not going to go through them if you're interested, but what you do see is 4 Newbiggin men who were Charles Gibson Clough, who was killed, John Thomas Story, which was killed, Benjamin Edmund Taylor, which was killed, and that's his memorial plaque from the Hellas Memorial, and Edward Hughes, who was wounded. So, what we've got now is we've now had a great slaughter. The attack is stalled. Krithia is now a dream that nobody is going to get to. And so what the Allies do now is hold the line. And that's basically what was going on. Men were killed holding the line. There was a local attack by the Hawke Battalion in June, straight after the 3rd Krithia, and they attacked a Turkish trench, which when they got there was full of dead Turks. Again, we have James Charlton killed, Albert Wright killed, Thomas Nichols wounded, and Hunter Barista Story wounded. Now, I'm sure you know some of these names. Next slide. Right, now, the Allies were fighting 2 enemies. first enemy was the Turks. The second enemy was the flies.
When I was copy editing this book for Alan, the bit that I found most interesting was the Gallipoli thing, because on Gallipoli, as Alan has mentioned, the bodies could not be buried. Now, you know yourself, if you find a bit of roadkill or whatever in the summer, it immediately becomes covered in flies and maggots and whatever. If you can imagine this whole, it's a barren, we've been there once or twice, it's a very, very barren territory, and it's covered in the only food that these flies have seen for quite a long time. And Joseph Murray, who wrote extensively about this, wrote a passage about what it was like living with all these flies, and I just thought you might be interested to hear what he said. We live on what is known, this is from a diary, we live on what is known as hard tack, cast iron biscuits and water, when you can get either. Once a day, if you're lucky, there's bully beef and fly stew as the main meal. For breakfast, you might get a rasher of bacon and a mug of fly tea. I'm sure they boil the bacon in the tea. In the evening, we get another mug of fly tea and either a piece of slimy, fly-covered cheese or share a tin of apricot jam between the lot of us. As you open the tin, the flies are so thick that they're squashed in the process. One never sees the jam. One can only see a blue-black mixture of sticky, sickly flies. They drink the sweat on our bodies and our lips, and our eyes are always covered with them. As we wipe them away, we squash them, thereby making more moisture for the others that take their place. There's no escaping them. The hundreds we eat do not seem to lessen the swarms. They're forever present, night and day. Can you imagine it? And you know, when Napoleon said an army marches on its stomach, can you imagine all those Anyway, I just thought you'd be interested to hear what Joseph said.
Thank you very much.
So the soldiers contracted a number of diseases: dysentery, diarrhea, jaundice, enteritis, to say a few. So they were dropping like flies. So they were taken away from the front. Some went to hospitals, some had to stay at the front. And there are some graphic descriptions of how they felt. However, a number were taken to field hospitals, and here is a Newbiggin man who died of enteric fever, John Samuel Roberts. There's his grave in a cemetery of Lemnos, which is a Greek island close to Gallipoli. I'd like you just to, I don't know if you've ever been to the war graves in France, but they're all stand-up, it's nice headstones. On Gallipoli, it is like a little plaque on the floor. And that's partly because of the soil depth. They cannot, support an upright headstone. And it's the only place I know where you have this type of headstone. We've been to Syria to see war graves, and it's like the Western Front war graves. So, we've been all over looking at war graves. Next slide. So, again, holding the line, July to December 1915, more Newbiggin men were killed or wounded. George Robinson, Charles Gorman, Gladstone Story, and Ernest Lawson.
Who remembers Gladstone's story? Everybody, I think.
Well, there's a picture of them. Next slide. And we go on. James Cook Wilson, Permanent Wood, Richard Smith, and Thomas Nichols, killed or wounded. just holding the line. That means defending the trench. No big pushes, no taking on the Turks head to head. It would be from grenades, from shells, or disease and being wounded. Next. I just thought I'd like to put this up. This was a Christmas card which was given to the troops to send home. It shows where they were fighting, but also a little bit of the Turks and the Brits exchanging Christmas gifts, i.e. bombs. But there is a point here. These troops were given this Christmas card to send home. However, in the background, thoughts were now developing in the British government and in the Army Council to evacuate Gallipoli. Obviously, Churchill was against it, but his power was waning. He lost his job as First Lord of the Admiralty, and so we'll talk about what happened to his little army in a couple of slides. Next. Right. On the 22nd of November, decision was made to evacuate the peninsula. All 3 beachheads were to be evacuated. And the quote was, it does not matter how the Turks were fooled, as long as they were fooled. Because by this time they had numerical supremacy, and removal of men would be disastrous if they attacked. On 18th December, Suvla and Anzac were evacuated without any casualties. However, the rules had been gone. The Turks knew what's going on. This left Hellas, where the Royal Navy Division was. And on the 4th of January, all non-essential troops were evacuated. This left about 16,000 men in the front line, of which 4,000 were the Royal Naval Division. They were there at the last, and you'll see they were always the last to be evacuated. On the night of the 7th to the 8th of January, Hellas was successfully evacuated without the loss of any men. Why the Turks didn't attack is open to conjecture. Many men better than me in this subject have advocated different reasons. I'm not going to go into that. Next. Right, after evacuation, the Royal Naval Brigades were left at Lemnos. Everybody else was evacuated back to England for work on the Western Front. Nobody knew what to do with these sailors. The army didn't want them. Churchill couldn't help them. So a compromise was developed. The Navy would pay the wages of the men. Sailors actually were paid more than soldiers in the Great War. They got more money per hour, or day as they were then. And eventually, the army said that we'd kick these men out, make them into soldiers, taken over into soldiers' formations, and we get the formation of the 63rd Royal Naval Division, made up of 3 brigades, 1 Royal Marines, with 2 battalions of reservists and another brigade of the 4 reservists. So we have 188th Brigade, Royal Marines and Anson and Howe, and 189 Brigade, Drake, Hawke, Hood and Nelson. Next slide. Now, the first big engagement on the Western Front was at the Battle of Ancre in November. Now, I'm sure you all know about the first day of the Somme. To the south of the Alba-Baron Road, the Allies did make some headway. However, north of that, no land was taken from the Germans. And here in November, we find the Royal Naval Division trying to take land from the Germans north of that road. The River Ancre was a swamp-infested river, and the British front formed up as four phalanxes. The Royal Marines, Howe Anson, Hawke Nelson, Hood and Drake. And the idea was that the 1st Battalion would take the first objective, which was the German front line and that railway line, the dotted green line. The 2nd Battalion would go through that and then take the next objective and then suffice it and keep going on until they got to what they call the red line. However, what the Allies didn't know was this German strong point in the centre of the first line. It caused a lot of casualties, especially to the Hawke and Nelson divisions and to Howe and Anson. The only troops that actually made their objective were from Hood and Drake, who were protected by the slope from the machine guns in the strong point. Right, we have here a significant number of Newbiggin men: Robert Armstrong, Edward Hughes, John Edward Sample, Oliver Dent, John Thomas Thompson, and Charles Gorban, who now has been wounded 3 times. Excellent. So, in 1917, the war goes on, and the war goes on this left bank of the Ancre, and the 198th Brigade are involved in what is supposed to be a very simple exercise. They were to capture the 2 trenches, Puiseaux and River Trench. However, somebody thought that a night attack would be a good idea. You've got to realise that in the First World War, there was no communications. Once they went over the top, that was it. Nobody knew where you were, nobody could send in reserves, and nobody could actually do anything to help each other. So, in the dark, the 2 battalions, the lead battalions, the Hawke and the Hood, managed not to stay in contact, and therefore a big hole was developed between the 2 battalions. They missed a lot of German positions, who then bounced up and shot them in the back. And so it was a utter disaster. We have here 2 men killed, 1 man killed, Edward Dawson and Thomas Simpson, who for his work on the Ancre was awarded the prestigious Distinguished Conduct Medal. He's the only man from Newbiggin the only Naval Reserve man to have this award. As February progressed, they moved along, keep moving along the Ancre on its north bank, and here's an attack basically by the Royal Marines and the Howe, with Anson supporting them, and again we have Richard Smith from Howe killed, and Henry Brown wounded from Anson. Now, we go on to the Battle of Gravel. Gravel was a village, a defended German village, full of everything, machine guns. It sat in the Vandenberg line and was heavily defended. Now, this was unusual warfare, because now we've gone from open trench to trench warfare, and now fighting in a village, and all the problems that happens. Germans are hiding in the rubble, they jump out and shoot you, you are fighting hand to hand. And there's a picture of what was it like, hand to hand fighting with the Germans. Again, there were casualties. James Sharp, John William Smith, John Henry Hall, who was wounded but was discharged invalid. In fact, he went to work back in Newbiggin Colliery. Then we have also Edward Hiscoff. After Gravel, the brigades were detailed to hold the line. Also, it meant digging trenches, being hit by artillery, German artillery. There were a lot of casualties, but only one man from Newbiggin was killed. Well, he was actually wounded initially, but died in hospital in northern France. His name was Edward Thompson Jefferson. 1917 was a busy year for the British Army. They wanted to dominate the Germans. They thought the Germans' morale had suffered a lot, and they thought the Germans were going to be easy to push back. Another big mistake. So they launched what they called Third Leap, or what people will know as Passchendaele. And obviously, I suspect you know what Passchendaele meant. It meant mud. And you can see on the bottom picture there what the scene was like. The Royal Naval Division, well, they attacked initially with the Marines in Howe and Anson, and their casualties were horrendous. However, by the time that the 189th Brigade were involved, their commanding officer of Hood, who was Edward Meredith,
Never mind, go on.
no, he was the son of the Prime Minister, Asquith, sorry about that, senior moment. He looked at the situation and said, yes, we'll do some night attacks, but not en masse. We'll survey the area, we'll find out how many Germans are in the trenches that we need to take, and we'll take them by small raiding parties. And this type of tactic saved a lot of lives. He was a great guy. However, we have two dead. A man called Graham, John Thomas Graham, who died of his wounds, and 3 days later, and Robert Headley, who died again wounded, sorry, he was wounded on the 26th. As I said, the British Army tried to dominate the Germans in 1917 and fought on a number of fronts, but one of them late in November was called the Battle of Cambrai. Again, initial British success, great German counterattacks, and we were driven back from all the land we held, apart from this little bit of land which was nicknamed Welsh Ridge. It wasn't a ridge. It might be a sandbar, but it was not a ridge. It was approximately 200 feet in height and had very little slopes, which made it very hard to defend. On Christmas Eve, the Germans attacked and they entered the British trenches, but eventually the naval brigades withstood these and drove them back.
A Newbiggin man, Maxwell, was killed on the 30th December. And if anybody knows Mr. Maxwell or is related to him, this is actually a new photograph. I managed to get a very blurred photograph which I sent to somebody and he cleaned it up. So I do not know if you've got a relative, I can supply you with a piece of this photograph if you require it. Next. Right, now we enter 1918. It is the Russians had sued for peace, and this released a lot of battalions onto the Western Front. The British were exhausted, the French were pretty decimated, and the British had to take up more of the line. On the 21st of March, the Germans attacked. Initially, they flooded the area held by the Royal Naval Division with gas. For 10 days before the 21st, they flooded the area with gas, and this affected 140 miners. Thomas Clark Taylor, James Taylor, John Thomas Dodds, George Norman, and George Cranston. Next slide. Then, on the 21st, the German onslaught. The maps just show you that we were pushed back. The whole British Army was pushed back over the Somme battlefield, which we had fought in 16 for very great miles. Next. There were 2 miners wounded. Marmaduke Wood was killed, and our friend John Mills Wood was wounded and was discharged invalid. From the numbers, you can still see there's a lot of miners still in these battalions. The prisoners of war were 79 miners. So we held the line, April to the line, and there were two Newbiggin men we could talk about. Matthew Nelson, wearing his old pith hat from 1915, and Nicholas Stevenson, who was wounded on the 16th of July and was discharged invalid. The last 100 days, push for victory. We have 5 Newbiggin men as casualties: Henry Brown, Matthew Nelson, Alonzo Lewis Peake, Henry Freeberg, and William Simpson. Now, 2 men died at home. One of those was Samuel Thomas Neal, and the other was John Thomas Dodds. Dodds was gassed in March, and although he went back to the front, I suspect he died from the effects of his gassing. Next. As I said earlier, 1 Newbiggin man from the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve got a Distinguished Conduct Medal, DCM. If you want, you can look in the London Gazette, you can see what he gets it for. But it was for the Ancre, the 3rd to 4th of 1917. Next.
So the DCM is what, second to the Victoria Cross?
Second to the Victoria Cross, right? Okay. 104 miners got a military medal from, and 8 of those with bar. Now, a bar means you won it again, right? So you awarded a military medal, but for another piece of bravery, you were given a military medal again. So they called it a bar. These men are George Cranston, Robert Clark Taylor, John Joseph Milburn, John Edward Sample, and John Robert Waldock. Another interesting fact is that actually miners became officers. to be an officer in the Great War, it was not really about your bravery, it was about how your attitude was. You had to be really from a good school. But there were some men who managed to go through officers' training and become very good officers. In fact, one man from Ashington won a military cross as an officer. Next. Did we have a land fit for heroes? I don't think so. What we have here is a picture of Francis Gormley, and I'm sure you can see that he has no leg. He had to go down the pit again. He worked with one leg down the pit, because that's what he had to do. Now, at the beginning of the war, the government invoked the Defence of the Realm Act, which was called DORA for short. Now, one thing you'll know about it, which still exists today, is British summertime. However, a more important part of this was the government took over mines, ports, and the railways. And during the period of the war, wages were pretty good for a miner in relative sense. However, the end of the war, Britain was bankrupt. We couldn't uphold things. The mine owners wanted their mines back. So they were giving them back. Wages were depressed. The miners wanted to go on strike, and they formed this triple alliance with the dock workers and the railway workers. But in 1921, the railway workers and the dock workers wouldn't go on strike, but the miners did. It was, for the miners, a disaster. Here's a soup kitchen for miners during the Great Strike. I've looked at the 1921 census for Newbiggin, and that was another thing that was delayed. Census usually took place in April, but in 1921 it didn't take place till June because of the miners' strike. I've looked at the 21 census for Newbiggin, and it looks like some miners went back to work before the end of the strike. Anyway, I hope this talk has given you some information, and I hope that you've seen maybe some of your relatives. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Alan. I think that really brought home some of the desperate circumstances of going to war. My goodness me. Can you take any questions?
Yes.
Anybody's got any questions?
Me? I'm a bit ignorant about Gallipoli. I'm slightly ashamed to say that. But why was Krithia, why was it considered so important?
Well, it was seen as the first objective. Oh, sorry.
Krithia was seen as the first objective on day one. It was never made, and so that's why I just used Krithia as a point to say we never made what we were supposed to do on day one.
Why did people join the volunteer reserve in the first place, Alan? I mean, you've worked a shift down the pit. I can't particularly see the attraction of joining a territorial force.
Well, there are a number of reasons you can think about. There are some works where people try to explain it. As Julia said, there's a guy called Murray, wrote 3 books on his time with the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve. He went to avenge his brother, because his brother had been killed on a naval ship. What I think is there's a lot of peer pressure. So you talked about Newbiggin, 100 men went. Ashington, about 250 men went. Obviously there was a lot more collieries. South Shields, collieries, nearly 300 men went. So I think there's a lot of peer pressure in certain mines. You go to other mines, for instance, if you went to Horden and Harrington in Durham, not very many miners joined up this force. So I think, and also, you've got to remember that if you were a young man, and a lot of these were young men, you got away from home. You didn't have your own house like you do now. You lived with your parents, probably sleeping 7 to a room sometimes with the lodgers. And so maybe it was easier to join up. There was no pressure from the government to join up. These were all volunteers, by the way. Conscription didn't come in till 1916, March 1916. So until then, these men were all volunteers. So all the men we talked about were volunteers.
Was there pay before the First World War to be in the volunteer reserve?
Yes.
Were you paid?
Yes, you were paid.
So there's the incentive.
Yes, and it's a bit like the TF.
Yeah.
You got a pay. The TF went to a camp every year, and these sailors were given 2 weeks on ships.
Yeah.
So it was like a holiday.
So it gets you out of the pits and you get paid.
And also,
Okay.
yeah.
I understand.
But maybe that's not the only reason. But there are not very many. There's 3 or 4. The War Museum in England, in London, has 3 dictations from miners, but none of them really give you the real reason why they went. You know, I was forced into it. But remember, a lot of these men were Kitchener's men. So 3,000 Kitchener's men were forced into the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve. And if I had expanded my area, then a lot of Yorkshire miners went into this force, as did a number from Cumberland, from the Cumberland coalfield.
Perhaps it was exciting. Perhaps they saw it as exciting.
Yeah. Until they had to dig through.
Until you get to Gallipoli.
Well, Gallipoli was a nightmare for them.
I thought that was desperate, that Sister Julia. Absolutely.
Well, late in November, it actually snowed on Gallipoli. You had never seen this. And of course, these men were in summer garb, and there were a number of men not from the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve who actually froze to death at that post. But one good thing was, it killed the flies.
A last point, and then we need to move on. Anyone else?
David had something.
At a very
David.
basic level, was it not possible that they opted for the Navy rather than the Army because the Navy got paid more?
Well, that could be a reason. That could be a reason. And they expected to go onto a ship. And if you look at the statistics for casualties in the Navy, there are much less than the Army. So maybe that was what their idea was, but they obviously got a shock when they became land-based troops. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons, but there's really no answers.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed, Alan and Julia. That's been absolutely tremendous. And the book is on sale, and well, in a way, I'm looking forward to reading it. It sounds an incredible piece of work from all that we've heard. There'll be a chance to buy Alan's book later on after the raffle, and we're just going to move over a little bit, and I'm going to bring Julia another seat, and I'm going to sit down there, and then we'll move on to the Second World War and the man who certainly deserves to be remembered in Newbiggin as well as in Stockport. Do you want that? So here we are. Okay. Can you see us, all the good folk across the country? Your talk has been going out to New Zealand and Italy and Nottinghamshire
Aberdeen.
and Yorkshire,
Andrew, he's from Aberdeen.
Aberdeen, Scotland as well as Newbiggin by the sea. So that's great. On your tables you have a piece of paper which is some information from Jim Armstrong about the work that he's been doing on Private Fred. Forgotten his name now.
Lamb.
Private Fred Lamb. Yeah, thank you. Okay. Jim, can you see this okay?
I can see it fine, yeah.
Yes, excellent. I'm just going to ask you to take us through this and tell us about what you've been doing.
Right, well, I'm not going to go through Fred's story because I think it's well known. But I wanted to put a picture of Fred up just to remind everybody what he looked like. It was definitely on show last Monday at the school. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the school visit as we go through this. So the little puppy.
I'm just checking, Jim. Can people hear Jim?
Hold the
No, we're really struggling. Is there
the
a...
mic near to the
Oh, try with a microphone next to the...
technology. Yeah.
Okay, give that a try, Jim.
That's not where the mic is.
Our technical genius is here.
Just good when it works.
Ah,
And then it's when the person that's using it knows.
Try that, Jim. No, it's not working. It's not making... Oh, man. Right.
We've lost him.
Are you still there, Jim? He is still there. Okay. Jim, take us very briefly through it. The thing that people can see is on the screen. So just try and we'll just go through your slides anyway, if that's okay. Just say a little bit about them.
Right, as I was saying, I wasn't going to speak about Fred as such. I was going to speak about the visit to the school.
Okay.
Which Fred may or may not have attended. We haven't quite worked that out. But the little poppy design you see is the design that has gone on the front of a basketball shirt. That basketball shirt has been presented to the school. So if you hit the next slide. So there's Fred's grave in the
There's a whole load of material that she's come up with regarding Fred. This is detailing the funeral that he had. So you can see from that, and I'll pass these details on to Hilton so he can incorporate it as and where he wants to. But there is quite a long article in the Stockport Advertiser, not a nationally known newspaper. She had to dig this out from the library. It's not even on the website. But there is this really detailed article about the funeral, which was quite an event. And then moving on to the next slide, Hilton. We've just been talking about a book that Isaac Grint has put together regarding the miners who joined the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve. Another person, Ray Whittle, has actually gone into the cemetery where Fred Lamb is buried and has gone through all the war graves in there. There are a number of them, and has detailed those. This I found to be quite something to just flip through that. It's also there's also a recording of what Ray has done. It was made by the BBC. You can get it on the BBC sound bites. It's on the BBC website. You can find it on that, and it actually tells Fred's story amongst the other stories.
Oh, brilliant, brilliant, brilliant.
Yeah. And then finally, this has got nothing to do with Fred. This is King's School, Macclesfield. It's a public school. It has a long history. It too commemorates things, particularly war service. You can see from the background there that they've got a flag. They've got various soldiers' medals. They've just taken another set of soldiers' medals. There is a real, with this, there's a real sense of when you wear a copy that you're wearing it for somebody, for some event. And one of the things that we wanted to do, or I certainly wanted to do with the Fred's commemorative shirt, was to make the whole thing of wearing a copy much more related to the youth of today. It's very hard now, I think, for somebody who's 15, 16 years old, coming up to adulthood, to relate to certainly the First World War and even the Second World War. It is now part of their history lessons. And when you're that sort of age, something that happened 80, 100 years ago is a long, long time ago. And I think it's important that we try and make this commemorative process as relevant as possible. So by doing this, I hope it's more relevant to the youth of today than just buying a copy or putting some flowers on a grave.
Thank you very much indeed, Jim. Thank you. Well, sorry about the sound system. It would have helped if I'd remembered to bring the loudspeakers with me, but never mind. They just to say that this is, and I'll even use the microphone as well. Just to paraphrase, if people here haven't heard the story of Fred Lamb. Fred is one of the 7 people who died in the bombing of Newbiggin, November the 7th, 1941. He's the only soldier to have died in Newbiggin on active service in either of the 2 world wars.
And the glorious story about Fred is that he sacrificed his own life, throwing himself across a pram to save a child from Newbiggin from a cloud of shrapnel there on Front Street at the junction of Simonside on that terrible evening. And this project has done a lot of work to uncover more the story of Fred and to link with Julie and Lisa, his granddaughters, and they live in Bolton now. But Jim there, who's Jim Armstrong, our born in Newbiggin but now living in North Wales, but now with a lot of links in Stockport as well, and through his company has really taken this on, and as Jim's described how he and Julie Sappho went the other evening along to present some basketball shirts to a school which has one of its teams as the national basketball champions. The school in Stockport nearest to where Fred is laid to rest and where he may have gone to, where he may actually have gone to school. And we're enormously grateful to Jim and his company for sponsoring those shirts with the poppy on and the remembrance of Fred Lamb on those shirts. And as Jim rightly says, it's a real way of bringing home the reality of war, the sacrifice of war, and the terrible nature of war to the youngest people of today. So I think, Jim, you've done a fantastic job there to really take the story of Fred back there to Stockport and work so well with his own family, and now link up with what we're doing here in Newbiggin. And who knows, one of these days we might get the name of Fred Lamb and John Dewars, who are the two names missing from the war memorial in Newbiggin. We've actually, disgracefully, only got 5 names on there from November the 7th. We might actually get the town council to put those 2 names on there, and that will be another day of commendation and remembrance of Fred, and another day for his family to come here. But thanks very much indeed, Jim. Really appreciate that. That's great. Thanks a lot.
I can remember that night.
Hang on. Barbara's just saying she can remember that night. I'm going to hand over to her.
Oh, well,
Go on.
I've got a big enough voice.
No, go on.
Well, I remember that night because I was sat on the side of the bath. We lived in Story Crescent then.
Uh-huh.
And we were sat, I was playing with the water, and the bomb went off and I fell in the bath. There's no water in it.
Look at you. Good for you.
Oh, Jim, you were saying something.
I was going to say the other thing is that we were really taking this on board.
Yeah.
I gave a little presentation, shorter than that, even only 8 slides, and they now use it for their little commemorative service on November 11th.
Brilliant. That's brilliant. That's great. Thanks very much indeed. Okay, we're going to have the raffle now, but can I just say before we go on that, our next meeting is the 2nd Saturday in December. We usually meet on the 3rd Saturday of the month, but in December we meet on the 2nd Saturday in the month. And the title is Newbiggin's Bonnie Bairns, and the presentation is by our youngest member, Zara, and myself. And I can assure you that in the run-up to Christmas, it is going to be about Newbiggin's Bonnie Bairns. It isn't going to be about death and destruction and terrible things and disease and all of the awful things that we've come across. It's going to be about Newbiggin's Bonnie Bairns. And as Newbiggin's Bonnie Bairns, I think you should all come along as well. So anyway, we're handing over to the raffle. Jill's going to say something.
For the raffle, just a reminder that we've got a
on the